Hawaii is my mainland. I'm Kauai Lucas, and we are here every Friday at 3 p.m. on Think Tech Hawaii. And jumping into things, because I have another all-star cast, pun intended. Today we're going to talk about what's been happening up on Maunakea and why there's such discord in the community about what's been happening up there. And to discuss it today, we have Dr. Julia Morgan, who is an instructor of religion and philosophy at Kauai Community College, and Camille Kalama, who's a staff attorney at the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation. And maybe you should say a little bit what the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation is, Camille, because not everybody knows.
Sure. We're a nonprofit law firm, and we specialize in Native Hawaiian rights and land issues. So we run the spectrum of Hawaiian homelands, land rights, quiet title, as well as Native rights, religious practice, and water use.
And Julia, although you are now a doctor of philosophy, you used to be an attorney.
Can you ever stop being an attorney?
Yeah, well, I love your life progression from Honolulu attorney at big law firm to to religion and philosophy for the moment at Kauai Community College. But I actually was inspired to have you on a month ago at the Hawaii Book and Music Festival, because you were talking about, what was the title of that talk, or what was it?
Oh, John Osorio changed it at the very last minute,
well,
and so I can't remember.
I thought, oh, how perfect. This is really the background that is missing in most education in the West of our presuppositions about science and religion and why we think the way we think. So thanks for coming, and give us a little snippet a long snippet of that talk at the Hawaii Book and Music Festival.
Okay, well, thanks first of all for having me. Whenever I sort of start to talk about my research in this topic in particular, I always feel like I need to say that I am not anti-science. I'm not anti-vaccine or whatever sort of the current common way to talk about that is. I grew up with a scientist father. I grew up looking at the stars through his telescopes that he used to bring home. So it's not like I come from a position that science is bad. My research started, and this was for my PhD dissertation and then has continued, it actually looked at the kalo patenting controversy that occurred in 2006. And the
kalo being the Hawaiian word for taro.
Yes, correct. And so I was looking at this, and on the one hand, we had folks at UH Manoa who were very adamant that what they were doing and patenting different strains of taro was very important, and it was going to save the kalo industry, and they were very betrayed in many ways by the opposition from the Kanaka Maoli. And so on the one hand, we have scientists over here who are like, we're doing good, and then we have Kanaka Maoli going, no, you cannot do this. You cannot patent a relative, an ancestor. This is not right. And so I was interested in that clash because when you read the material, even as late as 2009, which was 3 years after the initial kind of big confrontation, there's still a palpable sense of betrayal on the part of CTAR, which was the College of Tropical Agriculture
and Human Resources.
Yes, exactly. So they were still really hurt by this, and so I wanted to explore from a philosophical point of view what was going on, and to do that I started to look at the assumptions from the Kanaka Maoli, which really are Malama Aina, which you can talk about far better than I can, and then the assumptions from the Western perspective, and what I came to the conclusion of and what I came to realize is that we chose a certain way of portraying our science. It wasn't like this, the way our science, the structure of our science now was a choice, because there are other thinkers in our tradition that would have given us a much more holistic, a much more interconnected view of the world, but we don't teach them. or if we do, they're sort of taught as marginalized.
Can you give an example of that, Julia?
Yeah, I think, let me think. One of the examples I'll give is, say, Plato, which was the title of this talk. So Plato's view of sort of the connectedness of the world is that everyone but human comes back as sort of a punishment for something wrong. So women, for example, with men being the highest rung, women are women because they were men who didn't think as rationally as they should have. And then he just goes down, snakes and things that crawl on the ground didn't use their reason, so they crawl on the ground. And things of the ocean, I really think Plato had a drowning incident or something near death because he really hates the ocean. Like, that's briny, and things that are briny just have really no business existing at all. Which,
Not
of course,
very good for a Greek person. You're surrounded by the ocean.
Exactly. But such a contrast, right, compared to the Kumulipo, where the coral polyp is, right, at beginning. So that's kind of Plato on this one hand, and we have a definite, in a way, the only way we're connected with other things in the world is because we're being punished, right? But that stands in direct contrast to someone like Anne Conway, who was a thinker during the Enlightenment period. She was a really interesting woman. She was an amazing person who wrote one book, but she lived at a time when women were not formally educated. So luckily she had a father and a brother who allowed her to be educated. She suffered from debilitating headaches, and she still produced this amazing work where her argument basically is that we are all interconnected. And this is through a notion of God. So she was heavily influenced by Catholicism, but that each of us can move up and down, but we're still interconnected as sort of part of this one great creation. And to say, for example, like Descartes does, that nature and animals are machine-like is, I'm paraphrasing here, but the sentiment is the same, is just crazy. Like, you cannot say that things that are animated, and everything for her was animated, operate as machines. So if we taught Conway, not saying that we shouldn't teach Descartes, of course, but if we taught Conway and gave her as much focus as we did Descartes, then our ability to see the world differently would be set in the way we learn.
I call it opening the aperture to expand the lens. So let's go back to the Greeks just a little. So we had Plato, who said, I don't want to get wet, and not only I don't want to get wet, but there's a hierarchy involving rebirth, and you earn what you are, and the best thing you can be is a Greek man.
Right, absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And then from there we go, you skipped a lot, but...
I did. Something happens.
And then we get to the Enlightenment period, which is sort of the next high point as far as broader thought. But then something happened. What happened after that? Because, we had Anne Conway, but we didn't go with that.
Right, and that's a great way to put it, because we had sort of this, think about how the Enlightenment, and we call it modern philosophy, which is sort of frightening that we would consider something during the 1800s as our modern period. But that just goes to show how important it is for us, and by us I mean those of us raised in a Western tradition, right? The modern philosophy is sort of where all contemporary philosophy comes from, which isn't true, but that's kind of what we're taught. So during this modern period, which was just this amazing time, there were thinkers all over Europe who were like thinking many different ideas and battling it out, and they had these conversations going back and forth by mule, of course, because they didn't have the internet, but it was still, just this really amazing period. And out of that, we do get science. One of the people I do talk about is Francis Bacon and some of our early scientists, Newton.
So what was that scientific view of the world?
Well, it's interesting because the scientific, as we talk about Newton and Bacon today, is really very different than, it's carved. We've created idols, I guess, which is kind of funny because Bacon talks about idols. But we've created a vision of what they said and leave out the stuff we really don't like. So Newton talks about gravity, and when someone says, yeah, but where does it come from? Newton's like, God. Why do I even have to have this conversation with you? Ultimately, at the heart of everything is God.
Wasn't that what science was about back then? It was finding, proving that God exists.
Right, for some of them.
Right.
For someone like Bacon, you know, he definitely tried to separate science from religion so he could do his work. And so he argued that, look, religion and ethics, you come to know those things differently than you come to know science. So church, you don't need to be involved with me because I'm not doing your stuff. I'm doing something differently. Oh, and by the way, I'm helping humanity. And so this is where we start to get this idea that science is for the benefit of humanity. And we do still see that today. We of course don't question oftentimes scientific projects because they're what we call axiomatically, which means that there is nothing below that. It is taken as a given that it is moral and good work. But ironically, or tellingly, I guess, Bacon was really worried about us having just one set view of the world. He believed that to be really biased, and he said what happens with the human mind is we hang on to one thing, and then we try to figure out ways to say the other things don't make sense, just so we can keep hanging on to that one thing. So he came up with a series of different ways to avoid that, but I mean, I think of Bacon now in our context and what he would do. You know.
What do you do?
Well, I'm hoping, although I'm sure there are some Bacon experts out there who would disagree with me, I'm hoping what he would do is collect all of the worldviews. Because he was very methodical. He believed we should take down charts, and so we would be collecting the Kanaka Maoli views and the Western history views or scientific views and all of these things, and somewhere in the midst of all of this is going to be truth.
So there has to be somebody who's actually putting those down.
That's what a scientist does.
Yeah.
For him.
Yeah. We didn't have that here in Hawaii for a long time. I mean, we had our
Didn't have to write it.
Yeah, right. We had our oral tradition of it. And maybe you can talk about how that, I don't know, were you you were at Richardson, right?
Right.
Law school. So how was the law, was there some allowance for Native Hawaiian values?
That's a really good question. I think the whole reason I came into studying law is because I saw how it was used against not just Kanaka Maoli, but other indigenous peoples and oppressed peoples. And to understand, I think, communities, especially Hawaiians, who we had very powerful laws. We had very strong faith in the kapu system. It was life or death, literally. So we have this belief in right and wrong. And I think for a lot of us today, it's coming to realize that the laws that we talk about and that we fight over are created by men and women. They're enforced by men and women. They're interpreted by men and women. And it's not black and white. And values are absolutely embedded in them, and not just in the law themselves, but how they're used against people, how they're used for people. So I think the question of whether there are Hawaiian values in the law, as it stands, there are actually good things in the law right now, and that's what our office fights for. You know, we try to enforce those. But when it comes to how they're interpreted, how they're enforced or not, that's where we really find the battle, you know, because, and I think we have so many examples today where the law says one thing, but that's not what's happening on the ground, and you have to look back at who's making the decisions, who's enforcing or not those decisions, and eventually we get to the courts and what they think about those issues.
So Julia, why don't you just finish on that, the whole Kalo controversy, and kind of wrap that one up? Like, how did that play out, and where are we now with how did that kind of?
Well, on the ground, they what is the appropriate word? Not rescind. They
Revoke or
whatever the word is. They took back the patent.
Oh.
So there are no patents on those. I think
There was a 5-year moratorium or something
that you could not patent within that time. Yeah,
Yeah.
but those 3 patents that they were involved with, they ceremoniously ripped them up on the steps But I think, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this research is that despite that, I really believe that in many ways the capitulation on the part of the UH Manoa was because they were tired. They didn't really get it. So yeah, so that's where it ends, actually.
Okay, and with that end, we'll take a quick break and be right back on Hawaii is My Mainland.
Hello, I'm Crystal from Quack Talk. I've got a new show here. You've got to tune in. Check out my topics on sensitive, provocative female issues. So Tuesday mornings, 10 o'clock. Don't miss it. It's going to be fun and dangerous.
Hello, I'm Stephen Katz, and I'm the host of Shrink Wrap, which comes to you live every Tuesday at 3 p.m. on thinktechhawaii.com, and then it's repeated again whenever you want if you go to the website. On our show, we will be talking to all different kinds of therapists, psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, people who talk about the mind, the brain, and about different ways to find happiness. I myself am a marriage and family therapist in practice here in Hawaii, and I hope you will join us because I've got a lot to learn, you've got a lot to learn, and it's a great ride. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Welcome back to Hawaii is My Mainland here on Think Tech Hawaii. Today I have Camille Kalama, who is a staff attorney with the Native Hawaiian Legal Corp, and Dr. Julia Morgan, who is is an instructor of religion and philosophy at Kauai Community College. And we're talking about religion, science, and the law, basically, and how that is all coming together with Maunakea right now, sort of in the crux of it, is the Maunakea 30-meter telescope. And just so people have an idea of what it is, we have this lovely picture from KHON. So there it is. And I guess I should explain the Poliahu is the goddess up there, so that she was the one who embodies the spirit of the mountain. And when when John Osorio was on here 2 weeks ago, I guess, he sang that beautiful song he has written about the telescope, well, about Poliahu, really, and the relationship with the mountain up there. And he's not here, so I don't have to cry this time. So, Camille, tell us about your relationship with the mountain and how that has changed over the last year or so.
Sure. To be honest, my first time going up to Maunakea was in April of last year, 2015, after the first arrests of the protectors on the mountain. And I didn't come right away because I wasn't clear on what my kuleana was and how I could best support the protectors and what they were trying to do. But I came shortly thereafter, and I came to help as a legal observer, actually. I found that I could play a role to help with the protectors in these in the protests because of the huge amount of force that was being shown against them by the government, just the sheer number of officers involved, and my concern about the safety and also that the rights of our people were being protected as they were fighting to challenge the project.
Can you talk specifically about that? I can remember watching live streamed videos from people's cell phones as they were going on, and it was scary. I mean, who knew what was going to happen? But as a legal observer, you were right there, and did you have an official role?
No, I didn't. Legal observers are used on the continent, but they haven't really been played that much of a role here. And so, I mean, I had called up the chapter representative of the National Lawyers Guild. They have legal observers across the country, and there wasn't really an active chapter here. So it was finding materials and information that I could use asking folks like Kaho'okahi, Kanuha, is this something you want? You know, I wanted to make sure that whatever role I played was something that would be helpful and not.
And Kaho'okahi Kanuha's role at that time was not.
He was someone who had come to the Mauna to stand for it. He was not one of the petitioners that had been involved in the legal battles, but he and Lanakila Manguil were two of the young leaders that really emerged out of this movement.
And can you talk about some of the things that actually happened with the machines and the arrests? I mean, there were significant conflicts up there.
Right, and the unknown was the biggest concern, because none of us really knew what was going to happen. We knew that there were going to be heavy machinery that was going to come up the hill. We didn't know how many officers were going to be involved, or whether the National Guard was going to be brought in, or what techniques they would be using. So that morning of the time that I was there was in June 24th. That was the second round of arrests. And there were two enforcement agencies, the Hawaii, the Hilo Police Department and the Division of Coastal Docare.
Okay.
It was DLNR's enforcement agency. And I think we counted 30 vehicles, nearly, maybe 27 or 30 vehicles, and just a number of officers. And vehicles behind them were all the construction and the trucks behind them. And so we had a small group of us who were going to be stationed, you know, up and down the road so we could see who's coming and have good eyes on the ground. That was our job, to be observers. One of them was actually a former public defender from, I don't know, the Midwest somewhere. And he was a journalist who had spent 30 days on the mountain before that. Slept there at night, everything. And he actually had his foot run over by one of the police vehicles that was coming up the road. So all we heard was there's a legal observer that was run over, but he was okay.
So for a lot of people who haven't been up there, it is just the landscape itself is pretty powerful. I mean, what was your experience being up there, Jill?
Well, I was up there strictly as a tourist. This is before I started working for Kahea and really started to understand more about what was happening.
That. You're the former executive director of Kahea.
Just for a very short time.
Yeah.
Very short time. So we had gone up and dropped my father off at the observatory where you observe, and my father, as an astronomer, that was very exciting for him. And then we had gone up just a little bit ways further and walked out and saw the different stacking of the rocks and watched the sunset. And I have to say, it was probably one of the most amazing experiences of my time here. It was phenomenal.
So there was this group of defenders, that's a really good way of describing them up there. And then, back here in Honolulu or other places, where we're not in that sort of magical space. Magical maybe wasn't the right word. But when you're up there on the mountain, you're just acutely aware of nature in a way that you're just not here. So how do you feel that that experience informed the defenders, and did you have any sense that it also informed the enforcers?
That's a good question, and I just want to be clear that I don't speak for all of the protectors. I don't speak for all Kanaka Maoli involved, but from my ohana. And absolutely, I don't think you can go up there and not feel something or have that affect you in some way. And I think for the enforcement officers, it was incredibly difficult for some of them. I think it created huge conflict for them to be a lot of Kanaka Maoli officers having to arrest Hawaiians. And especially, I think, in the manner that they did, because there was no violence. The protectors, the defenders were just simply, standing there using their bodies and not vicious, appealing to their sense of humanity, of their sense of aloha aina for this place, for each other as Kanaka Maoli, and for everyone who really lives here. And so I think that I could tell that really affected the officers. They started to explain themselves and say, I have Hawaiian grandchildren, and, actually started to cry, the lieutenant. At the end, he was in tears, and I don't know if that was frustration or he felt it, but for me, and I think everyone involved, it really affected us. And I could tell you a story about that day in June, and how the mist was, so thick you couldn't see, 50 yards ahead of us, all throughout the day that morning. And somebody had offered a few of us a ride down from where we finally finished. And we thought, no, it's okay, we'll walk. And when we stood up to go down, we looked over and it was clear and sunny. And we realized we hadn't even gone a mile. So yeah, we can walk. But, the intensity and the mist that was there and just the whole mauna that day was incredible.
So now, Camille, I'm going to ask you to talk a little more from your attorney brain and maybe speak to why there is such benefit to the Native Hawaiian community that people are willing to go there with their person, with their body, and put that on the line.
Sure. I think before I forget, I want to emphasize that one of the major issues that those on the Mauna talked about and those who were supportive of the action talked about was a nationalism issue. And the way that I try to explain that is, it's really about who gets to decide what happens to our sacred places here, and Kanaka have lived here for hundreds of generations. And so we have a kuleana to this place. And that aloha aina that we feel is really a deep-seated commitment to the aina. It's not about, aloha kanaka. This is aloha aina as one of us. And that also gives us a very long-term view of how we care for this place. And, telescopes have been around since the 1960s. Our people have been around much longer. And so when we talk about, these are some of, if not the most sacred place in Hawaii. And that plays into the idea in culture about, elevation and the highest places being very important. And that's not unique to Hawaiians. There are many other cultures that have that kind of value.
Well, let's just take a break right here now that we're at the high point and come back in a minute and talk some more.
Aloha, I'm Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I'm fortunate to be able to host Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com. I hope you'll join in with us every Tuesday from 12 noon to 1 p.m. to see the interesting people we have to share with you their information. Aloha.
Aloha, this is Reg Baker and I am the host of Business in Hawaii. We talk about positive stories of businesses in Hawaii, how they have been successful and how they have overcome some of the obstacles that a lot of us encounter when we try to have a business here. And believe it or not, there are a number of positive stories here and we want to talk to all of you. So we broadcast live every Thursday at 2 o'clock. And it rebroadcasts again on Olelo Channel 54. So I sure hope to see you next time. Please tune in on Thursdays at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Welcome back to Hawaii is My Mainland. I'm Kauai Lucas, and with me is Dr. Julia Morgan and Camille Kalama from the Native Hawaiian Legal Corp. And we are talking about the conflict around values from the Native Hawaiian perspective and the Western educational perspective that have come to a head up on Maunakea with the 30-meter telescope. So Julia, you were just, over the break, you were talking about this space-based concept. I really like it. Talk some more about that.
So the idea is that there's this, the way we know things is called epistemology, right? So it's the study of how we know what we know. And there's a notion of what we refer to as space-based epistemology, Kwan Hong Chun and myself, and I'm sure others. But the idea is that it is just like space, right? There's no real context to it. It's based on universal principles. It doesn't matter who the knower is, because it's unbiased and factual, right? So when you were talking about the mist, and when you were talking about that feeling, and when I had that feeling, none of that would be considered part of knowledge. That would be very nice mysticism and it's good, nice work, right? But
it doesn't count.
It doesn't count, right? And in the Chinese tradition and other indigenous traditions, Kanaka Maoli, there's more of a place-based epistemology where knowing is a relationship to a place. So my relationship to the place here is always going to be different than Camille's and yours, because I'm not genealogically connected. But with a place-based knowing, you can incorporate that experience, the consciousness, the awareness, the witnessing. These are Manu Meyer's terms. Both spiritual mind and body connections to a place. But in kind of classic Western epistemology, all of that is too biased, and it won't give us truth. It must be unbiased to give us truth. And I think that that's also a clash. And so we see that in the newspaper, where it's sort of...
It's science versus culture.
Right, or science versus
if that's
religion.
Different.
Yeah,
right,
right,
that too.
Right.
And I just heard, I was just hearing someone talk about a book about wayfinding and GPS. And it makes me think about how, there's astronomy, and it's the study of stars. And they try to compare that to Hawaiian navigation and use of the stars. And they're very different, whereas Hawaiian wayfinding and navigation was all about relationships, where we are in relation to one another, to ourselves, to these places. And we're relying on the stars for that purpose, right, to help us get somewhere. And, I've heard it pointed out many times, but when Europeans thought the world was flat, Hawaiians were sailing all over the Pacific using non-instrument navigation. And so that's one major difference, is that translates into everything we do, that it's relational in many different ways, and not isolated or siloed, like you were saying. Science is, disconnected, whereas our science is interconnected.
So that basic value of the connection, of the relationship, is a concrete, real value, maybe not in the space system, but for those of us who have been brought up in some tradition that isn't purely Western, that is absolutely real. And I think that anyone who goes up to Maunakea, and there are other places, certainly Kaho'olawe will do it for me too, where that is real. So how is the legal framework? You're in the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation. So in that framework of Western law, and yet having the Native values, how do you see that working itself into the Maunakea issue?
Well, our office actually has represented Kila Kila o Haleakala in fighting the solar telescope on that mauna, and the issues are very much overlapping. And it can be quite difficult to try to explain to those that don't have the same values, or see what we talk about as a real thing. But there are so many layers and perspectives coming from the Hawaiian community on Mauna Kea. And you can see that with just the sheer numbers of Hawaiians and others, and the diversity of perspectives. But it's fundamentally, a culture. This is an ancestor, and that's something that makes it hard to talk about in the law. But it's about sincere beliefs, and that's what our clients and our kanaka truly believe. And that's something that we have to then take and, I wouldn't say translate, but present to the decision makers in a way that they can either be receptive to or choose not to. And as we saw with the Supreme Court ruling on Maunakea, they accepted as valid these traditions and customs and culture on Maunakea as a given. They said, you know, it's unquestionable that there are traditions that need protection. But as we see in many important cases involving Native peoples, not just Hawaiians, the decision turned on procedure, right? It was about due process and a fair hearing, you know, the fact that a decision was made and then a hearing was held. And that happened both on Haleakala and for Maunakea. And it's really about development and economy pushing decision makers to act quickly in the time frame of the developer or the funding, really. And that was the other thing about Polynesian wayfinding that is important, is they didn't need time. They didn't need a clock, right? Whereas European navigation relies heavily, you have to have a clock for longitude. But in the same way, I think it's the same thing, is that when we, as Kanaka, as a community, look at a project, it's about, you know, is this right? Let's make sure that we understand what the impacts are. Let's make sure we also understand the benefits. How is this going to benefit people, benefit the community or the planet? Explain that to us. And if it's set on this time frame of money or business or economy, which is really one person's lifetime, then we never get to really come to a good Apono decision.
Because that takes the longer view.
Right.
Yeah, okay. And the, speaking, there have been so many stories. I don't know how many groups there are just on Facebook that are dedicated to this, but I do know of one closed group that has over 18,000 members. So this is not a small movement. Can you talk about some of the ways that you've seen that the benefits of this process?
Sure. Just in my own ohana, we were unable to take our keiki me maikane. One, because he was going to put his body on the front line, and he did end up getting arrested. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, so we weren't able to go with them. So their one wish for their winter break or Christmas was, please take us up to Maunakea. And we did. And it was, so the awareness, the understanding, I was able to explain to them why it's important. They knew the oli, they knew our
and how old are they?
Meleko'i honua. They were 6 and 7 at the time. Now they're 7 and 9. But I said, you remember Owakia, the oli, and they do, and they were able to connect that and understand what the big issues were, or at least get to talk about them. But beyond that, it was just the relationships, again, that we were all able to make with each other. Just recently, one of my friends who wants to come and help at our farm over here, he said, that was one great thing about Maunakea, is that I got to know people like you, and we get to, continue to work together, not just to fight things, but to build.
To build. Oh, thank you. So that is really a critical part of this. I mean, this whole, the Maunakea thing, or Haleakala, they're all really symptoms of the underlying conflict. And so let's talk about that a little, because it doesn't matter if it's Papahanau Mokuakea. I was at a 4-hour OHA meeting yesterday on that. This keeps getting played out over and over again. Maybe in our last few minutes, you can talk, both of you, about that grounding wound that is not being addressed here.
And I think that's hugely important to remember that this struggle is connected to Pohakuloa, which is right down the road. at Maunakea, the military occupation there, Kaho'olawe, which was returned to the state, toxic, and Pohakuloa was taken about the same time, and even more acreage was taken at the time Kaho'olawe was returned. There was Waikane that was, it's not able to support life anymore. We can't even go in there, and that was taken from a family that relied on that place.
Because of live ordinance.
Because of live ordinance.
It's still to this day. Yeah.
And I think people have maybe some trouble connecting that to Maunakea, but
Right.
it's all about how are we taking care of this aina, this place.
And it's just one incident after the next, after the next. Julia.
I had something all ready to go, and then I just got
It's
a pregnant pause.
Yeah.
So I guess
As a kahea, you were dealing with it on many levels.
yeah, and so I don't want to talk about it on the kahea level.
Okay.
As I want to talk about it as a Hawai'i, right?
Okay, all
I
right,
mean,
go for it.
what is my responsibility as someone in philosophy, as an educator? What should we be doing? Because it's always you all pushing against us, right? Or trying to listen.
People like you.
Yeah, well, I know, but this kind of these traditions, and it's always, and I think our tradition needs to step up. I think people who teach philosophy need to step up, and there are lots of us who are doing that, right? There's postmodernists, there's people moving into indigenous work, but I just came from the East-West Philosophers Conference, which is the largest conference of comparative philosophers, and even there's still this notion of objectivity, and a third party will make a decision as to whether your actions are good. And we need to do a much better job of recognizing the plurality and the diversity of the world, and not be hegemonic at all. I was going to say not quite so hegemonic. That's my hope for tomorrow. My hope for next week is not hegemonic at all. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I think we have, in addition to being occupiers, we also have like a serious intellectual responsibility that we're not meeting.
I heard a Professor Wildcat, he came to give a presentation. He's a native Indian scholar and professor, and he used the term, what do you call it? A responsibility that is, you can't take it away. What is that word?
Irrevocable?
Almost. Like human rights. I'm so sorry, I just lost the word.
Okay.
But for me, it was that kuleana that we all have, no matter where we come from, and it's just different. It's different for every Kanaka Maoli. It's different for non-Kanaka that come here. But we all have kuleana, and it's whether you choose to awamo that, whether you choose to carry it or not. It's not whether you have it or not. You have it, but are you choosing to carry it? And,
So, yes, I think that's our homework.
Sure.
Thank you, Camille and Julia, for being here today with me and talking about this in such a deep way and an intelligent way.
Thank you.
Thank you.